Hello and welcome to the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies new series, the CEAS Knowledge Café, Conversations Without Discipline. I'm Claudia Rowland, the event manager for CEAS. In this session, the conversation will be between two of our most esteemed CEAS academics, Professor Diane Koenker and Professor Mark Gagliotti, who will be talking on the informal economy. I'd like to introduce them briefly. Diane Koenker is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union who was appointed the director of CEAS in 2018. She began her research career investigating the social elements of the 1917 Russian Revolution, then moved to explore the fate of workers under Soviet power by looking at workers in the printing trades in the 1920s. For her next project, A History of Soviet Vacations, she wants to explore the entire sweep of Soviet history. This research was published in her book, Club Red, Vacation Travel and the Soviet Dream in 2013. That research led to conclude that the 1960s was the pivotal decade in the transformation of the USSR, and this is the subject of her current research into Soviet consumer culture in the long 1960s, from Sputnik to Detente. As a fun fact, she was the first American researcher to work in the archives of the city of Sochi in 2006. Mark Gagliotti is an expert on modern Russia. He was appointed as an honorary professor at CEAS in 2019. He is the author of many books. His next one, already out in the US and out in February in the UK, is A Short History of Russia. He's working on a book about the changing nature of interstate conflict and a longer-term project on how Russian intelligence and security community affected politics, businesses, and society. Fun facts, to the best of his knowledge, he is the only Western academic who can say he has set foot in the HQs of the CIA, MI6 and the KGB, and his dog Penny has the distinction of US, Russian and Czech passports. We've given them the broad topic of the informal economy, and we'll see where this conversation takes us. So thank you to our presenters, thank you to those watching, and we hope you enjoy this celebration of interdisciplinarity. Off you go.
Thanks, Claudia, for that introduction, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Mark and sharing our research with one another and learning from one another as a part of this conversation. We wanted to start off talking about how we got into these topics and where we're coming from. And I suppose my approach to informality in late Soviet economy comes from really two different directions. As an historian, my interest has always been in the experience of ordinary people and everyday life, even in the extraordinary months of the 1917 Russian Revolution. And my career as an historian of Russia began just as the serious study of Soviet history was taking off. Up until the mid-1960s, historians did not consider the Soviet period to be worthy of study, in large part because the Russian historians who taught them disapproved of the Russian Revolution and believed that everything that happened after 1917 was illegitimate. So those people writing about the Soviet experience up until the mid-1960s tended to be economists and political scientists. But as it became more possible to access libraries and archives, I found myself asking questions about how the Soviet system worked. And what it was like to experience the Soviet system and what were the gaps between the ideals of socialism and reality. And so that led me to areas where I could explore these questions, which included shop floor relations between men and women, leisure practices, and most recently, retail trade. My work on tourism led me to want to know more about the pivotal decade, the 1960s, which began with Khrushchev's utopian Communist Party program. It included ambitious economic reforms designed to make the economy serve the people's welfare, and it ended with the erosion of those dreams and reforms, with a rise of criminality, really, and a rise of the informal economy. But there's also a personal element in what I'm working in now. My first visit to the Soviet Union was in 1973, when I went to conduct research for my PhD dissertation. And I was fascinated by the society around me. I tried to use my Soviet friends and other contacts, journalists, diplomats, to make sense of it all. What I encountered were anomalous retail practices, the three-line system, the adding up purchases on abacuses, the sudden and random appearance of orange sellers on street corners. You could never know when or where you would find them. And also I discovered there was an art of the bribe, which was important even for foreign researchers. So in a way, my current research is aimed at bringing an historical understanding to my own lived experience. The problem with informality, though, is it leaves few formal traces. Certainly, archival sources focus on structures and rules rather than rule breakers. I found the archives of trade unions, which discuss disciplining workers, among other things, to be one point of entry into informality. Memoirs and travel accounts, especially by perceptive Western reporters, also provide anecdotal insight into these practices. But I'd like to hear more from Mark about how political scientists are able to get inside these kind of hidden illegal practices. For me, an important conceptual influence was an article by the economist Katzenellenbogen, who wrote about colored markets, and which provided a way of understanding how informality worked in the economy. The red market was the fully legal market, the black market was fully illegal, but in between there was a whole range of colored markets, pink markets, gray markets, brown markets. I think we'll have more to say about how we see informality in our research, but I'll turn it over to Mark for his origin story.
Thanks, man. Yeah, and I must admit, for me, as someone who, ultimately still thinks of himself as an historian, that was my first degree, then did my doctorate in political science or government, and these days, in a way, dabbles across the realms of criminology all the way through to international relations. Either I am indeed the perfect representative of interdisciplinarity or an amateur who just goes where he will. But from my point of view, again, this is always a great virtue of being associated with CEAS, because it is precisely the interdisciplinarity of the conversations. And I really became, well, in a way, I became aware of the informal economy in my very, very first trip to the Soviet Union, which was actually in 1980 when I was a 15-year-old. But I'll come to some of those experiences later. But particularly in my doctorate, I worked on the impact of the Afghan war on the Soviet Union. So I wasn't so much looking at the war as actually how it played out in everything from culture to the experiences, particularly of veterans. And this was in very much the dying days of the USSR, 1988 to 1991. And the thing that struck me whenever I was talking to veterans, who pretty much by definition were members of the sort of disenfranchised underclass, because if you had any pull, any money, you made damn sure, well, ideally that your kid never went into the military in the first place. But if he had to, you made damn sure he wasn't going to go to Afghanistan. So it was essentially the people who had nothing who ended up going there. And they came back and they still had nothing. Well, no, not quite right. They had very, very high promises of all the things that were going to be done for them. Very few of them ever materialized. And so almost by definition, they were living lives informally. They were being involved in a whole variety of work activities which were well outside their sort of formal remit. And I'm talking about everything from gangsters through to just simply day laborers. And also they are having to go to the informal economy, not just for day-to-day practicalities, but often just simply for example, medical necessities. When you've dealt with someone who had both legs blown off by a mine, and who, when going to the hospital, had been told that his artificial limbs were ready for him, but being told, no, I'm sorry, there's no way we can actually release them to you until you get us a medical certificate saying that you have no legs. And the attempt is, well, there's certain proof that, I don't know. And it was clearly, it was all part of the way in which informality and corruption had become increasingly linked. And I think this is one of the interesting processes, because I do a lot of work on criminality specifically. And it's watching the ways that informality, which is technically illegal, but often socially acknowledged as okay. It's a little bit like, I don't know, mild speeding or mild tax evasion. A lot of people do it, but there is that sense of, well, it's not really that wrong. And then outright criminality. At what points do they intersect? When do they come together? And is it a parasitic process, or is it actually one that is voluntary? Or at what point is there a sense that within the moral economy, there is crime and there is the informal sector? And particularly in the context of a society in which almost everyone has to engage. Again, go back to the time when I was doing my PhD as a crass and callow kid. I had lined up an interview with a senior Warsaw Pact country diplomat who actually, I mean, he was the minister counselor, but because the ambassador was back at the sort of capital for briefing, so at that point he was the senior representative of that country. And I was very pleased with myself having lined up this conversation. It's important, you know, just been to a meeting at the Kremlin and so forth. Anyway, we talked for a while, and this was in 1990. And then he kind of rather apologetically said, look, I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop now. We can talk again in the future. He picked up this carrier bag that was clanking. And the reason for that was that this very senior diplomat was off to go and swap vodka for soft toilet paper. He knew someone who was selling soft toilet paper. And that's really what got me thinking. You know, when you actually have someone who is well paid, money is not the issue, is well placed, not quite at the top of the system, but very, you know, really rather well placed within this. But even this person had to turn to the informal economy just to be able to wipe his bottom in comfort. And I think this is it. It's this pervasiveness and the way that with the end of the Soviet system, there was actually a shift in the way informality worked. It didn't go away, it changed its nature. And part of that was, you might say, in Soviet times, everyone had rubles, but there were no goods in the shops for you to actually spend them on, or, well, unless you wanted the collected works of Karl Marx. Whereas, certainly in the 1990s, there was a situation where everything was in the shops, but no one had the money to be able to afford it. And therefore, the nature of informality, of how you connect yourself with the goods and the services that you're looking for, changed. So I think for me, it's very much been looking at informality. It's always been slightly tangential to my kind of core areas of interest, which are, you know, outright criminality, high politics, and security affairs. But looking at informality, in some ways, it's a way of gauging the disconnect between the conventional economy and the aspirations of ordinary citizens, and the conventional system and the values that it espouses, and the values of the culture as a whole. And so this is why I'd be particularly interested in hearing when we look at sort of such, you know, core activities as retail and tourism, precisely how your research and mine kind of interconnect. So tell us about tourism.
Right. Well, I think that this is a great line to turn over on. Yeah, I think one of the questions I would like to think about as we continue the conversation is, to what extent is kind of the cultural experience and practice of informality, which we can talk about arose as a necessary response to an economy of scarcity, to what extent did that culture need to continue and people develop skills of coping in the informal way? What happens after 1991 when capitalism comes and presumably the market decides everything? To what extent do those informal practices still become part of people's skill sets and are really necessary for surviving? But let me go back to what I think I can offer here is some sense of the kind of empirical experience of the way the economy worked. So my first really entree into informality was my study of tourism, which informed my. I explore a lot of different themes in this project, not just informality. And I think it's important to understand how informality works, to understand the nature of Soviet leisure travel, which came in really two variants. One, and I think the most privileged and the most popular, most esteemed form of leisure travel was medical tourism. You'd get a pass to a sanatorium or a secondary rest home. And the purpose was to heal a particular condition or to just recover from the grind of daily life. And so the Soviet regime built really palatial sanatoriums, mostly on the shore areas of the Black Sea and in some of the mineral water areas of the Caucasus Mountains. And this was the most prestigious kind of vacation. You went to this place for 14 or 28 days. You engaged in a series of medical processes like mud baths or sunbathing. Sunbathing was monitored by a nurse. It wasn't just for getting a nice tan. And in this place, you recovered your well-being. But these were so opulent that not many were built and so few people could go. And officially, to go to one of these sanatoriums, you had to have a voucher that you got from your trade union, which said that you had X medical condition that required you to go to the sanatorium where it could be treated. So that was the system, but in reality, and here's where the informal part comes from, it was the people with clout who got the vouchers to the best sanatoria at the best time of year, which was summers. And so if you look at the distribution of vacationers, workers, industrial workers who were in theory the most needy of this medical treatment, they got the vouchers to the least prestigious places in the Urals in the winter. And it was officials and intelligentsia who got the vouchers to Sochi in the summer. And these people with clout also got vouchers for their secretaries and other young women in their offices, because another side benefit of these medical treatments was the opportunity to be there without your spouse and to engage in all kinds of hanky-panky, which was an important part of the experience. So people use these informal methods, kind of bribing the trade union officials to rearrange the arrangements for tourism. And whenever I discuss my work with Russian friends, somebody would always have a story about how they arrived at a place with no reservation, no voucher, and lo and behold, with the payment of a few rubles or a lot or a bottle of vodka, a place was found for them. And these stories were their great Soviet success stories. So this was something that they learned how to do. And it was a skill that Westerners coming into the system had no idea how to accomplish. I remember when I was working in the archives, I was not receiving any materials on my topic, which was the 1917 revolution. Another Western historian said to me, you have to know how to bribe the archivist. And what you do is you come in with your bottle of vodka in a carrier bag. You take it to the check room, get the token for the check room. You give the token to the archivist as a little gift. And sure enough, you would get your materials the next day. That works for men, it doesn't work for women. And it works for men working on 19th century Russian history and not Soviet history. So the bribes don't unlock everything. Back to tourism though, I mean, tourists initially tourism was just traveling around the country for the purpose of sightseeing under one's own steam, whether walking or biking or horseback riding or boating. And you stayed at tourist bases, which were converted school buildings or tent camps. You cooked your own food. It was very minimal. But people wanted to take vacation trips and they wanted to go to the sanatorium, but there weren't enough of them. So this gave rise in the 1960s and the 1970s to the phenomenon known as wild tourism. Tourism outside the formal channels of either the health spas or the tourist bases. And in the realm of tourism, the wild tourist sector was larger, the informal sector was larger than the formal sector. That's how many people were engaged in this. The informal economy and tourism built on a private market in room rentals, people living in these towns along the Black Sea, many of them retired army officers, so maybe there's an Afghan connection here. They would rent rooms to people, either they'd find out through word of mouth, somebody had rented the year before and passed on the name, or people would simply, with rooms to rent, would meet incoming trains at the Sochi train station, hold up a sign and say, I have a room to rent, and they'd make an arrangement that way. Such arrangements were normally self-catering, but they put a huge demand on the food supply for the area. And so here's a place where the informal economy and the formal economy had to intersect. Government tried to organize this through tourist bureau or housing bureaus and try to regulate the sanitary conditions of these rooms, but they really couldn't cope with the demand. And so people went into the informal economy, not because they preferred to be outside the system, but because that was the only way that they could get the vacation that they wanted. And in public opinion surveys, it's clear that Soviet people wanted the formal vacation. They would much rather stay in the Sochi sanatorium, but they simply couldn't get access to that. So there continued to be this informal market, as well as a secondary market, the secondary market in sanatorium places. You knew people in high places, or you knew how to pay the bribe to get that room. And this all seemed kind of benign and on the edges of legality. I think in post-Soviet times, the Wild West of the market in places like Sochi led to even greater opportunities, not just to take rooms and exchange them for bribes, but to take land and exchange them for bribes. And you have the phenomenon after 1991 of huge swaths of the public lands being sold off for people to build their own private luxury accommodations. So I'll turn it over to Mark to comment on how this fits into your perception and experiences.
Well, I think there's a couple of sort of broad thematic points I want to make before actually sort of slightly shifting the focus. I mean, one is it's interesting, this relationship between bribery and informality, that there is outright corruption. There is but then there is also this wider realms of Blatt, as our colleague Aljona has written about, the economy of favors, and how far a lot of this wasn't just simply a straightforward transfer of vodka for access or money for an informal room. A lot of it was actually within the context of, someone who knows someone, and you'll do someone a favor, you'll whether it's mundane like walking the dog or babysitting, or it's actually because you've got, let's say, some particular skill or service that you can provide. And one way or the other, things work themselves out. And I think this is one of the, for me, fascinating aspects of studying particularly the Soviet era, is exactly this extent to which there was a formal state economy, and there was this massive, and as you said, I mean, with wild tourism, actually larger economy that was just created by the Soviets themselves. And in some ways, one could think of this almost as an ode to the Russians, and not just Russians, but capacity to create systems that suit them better than the one that the state demands that they accept. And then this link to the whole business of precisely how the state then actually often tried to catch up. Rather than just simply saying we will suppress this out of existence, it had to recognize that, well, this is a need, people want it, it's actually worth instead trying to regulate it, and whether it's the sanitary conditions of homes or whatever. I know we'll be talking about retail in a moment, but it reminds me of the Berioshka shops, which were hard currency shops, essentially for ways of trying to milk tourists of their dollars or their pounds or whatever in return for sort of rather naff tourist souvenirs and such.
And jewelry like this, yeah.
But the point is, and then sometimes you would go into Berioshkas and you'd see, transistor radios and things. And think, well, what on earth would a tourist want with a transistor radio? And the answer is it wasn't. It was, in fact, that people were trying to gain access, whether it was in terms of the sort of hard currency vouchers that were used as sort of a bonus currency, in order that ordinary Soviets could go and get deficit goods, or whether it was actually the economy of favors, whereby a certain number would then disappear from the shelves and be distributed to your friends. There is this whole way in which the intersections between the formal and the informal are really very complex and exactly very revealing. And particularly in terms of the tourist sector, I mean, the area that I've looked at is, turning it the other way, is precisely the foreign tourists and the sort of growing campaign within tourist to bring in foreigners. Something that was originally envisaged often as a sort of soft power thing, but increasingly just was a desperate quest for foreign money. And what that did was, it's interesting because in a way the foreigners that came in actually became the focus for massive informal economic activity, some of which was visible to us and some of which wasn't. I mean, there was the obvious thing, there was the black marketeering. The people who would accost you in the lift or whatever and try and get you to sell your Levi's. And actually also an incredibly sort of varied array of wants. I mean, I was struck with my very first trip at the newly built Hotel Cosmos, right by the VDNK exhibition of economic achievements. And I'd heard about, how the Russians will try and buy your jeans and so forth. And in fact, there I was on the lift when this Russian accosted me and said, "You have Agatha Christie?" He didn't have Agatha Christie novels. And I later discovered that actually there was, there's a huge passion for them. And whereas Sherlock Holmes, for whatever reason, the regime had decided was okay, and there were official translations that you could buy. Agatha Christie, for whatever reason, seemed to be beyond the pale. And so there was actually a bizarrely prosperous Agatha Christie resale market. So there you go. If only I'd known, I could pack my suitcase with, you know, whatever Byzantine murder stories. But the point is, I mean, obviously that meant that there were whole networks of people who were there to precisely try and relieve foreigners of their goods. But then what happened is you actually had the emergence of underground workshops that would, for example, create homemade jeans, which they would then sell as if, oh, we've just bought this off some visiting, you know, this is Levi's, absolutely. We've just bought it off a foreigner to explain why you suddenly have access to them. And so, you know, these kind of, you know, much like fragments of the True Cross in medieval times, that if you put them all together, the True Cross was probably about 4 miles long. Well, likewise, you know, probably for every one Levi's or pair of jeans that was sold, a dozen were then resold on to punters as having just been bought from a foreigner. You had the economy which emerged around the tourist guides, who could get you access to things that you couldn't normally, but you know, in return for a fee, for a price, for a service. And again, they became really powerful gatekeepers, because a small tip from a well-meaning foreigner, actually, if that was in hard currency, that had massive disproportionate impact. And it might be better to actually sell the money rather than actually try and use it yourself. So hard currency speculators weren't only trying to sell rubles to Westerners, but also were going for tourist guides. Now, of course, what this means is it becomes a honeypot that naturally attracts all kind of other interests. You had the KGB that was very keen to recruit all kinds of, you know, speculators and black marketeers, both as intelligence sources, you know, but also as potential sources of compromising information. That if there was someone you actually wanted to put pressure on, you know, black marketeer makes a deal, and suddenly at that point, this person gets arrested because they've just committed a crime. And so what happened was the KGB made its own deals with the people who preyed on or provided services to the tourists, depending on how you want to look at it. And that raises another question. Is that also an informal economy? If a state security officer says, I will turn a blind eye to your criminal activities in return for you providing me with a steady stream of juicy tidbits of information, I mean, actually, that is another illegal, informal exchange of services that is taking place. Just because one's a KGB officer and doing it in the course of his duties doesn't necessarily mean it's not. So again, it's just the way in which the formal and the informal blur so heavily. And it's no wonder then that actually major hotels in Moscow very much became hubs for local organized crime syndicates. I mean, most notoriously, the Ostankino Hotel, that became the hub of the Ostankino organized crime group that was essentially a Chechen gang under a person called Magomet the Big. Because the hard currency and the opportunities for informal enrichment that a serious hotel provided was enough to give you the muscle, to give you the clout, to give you the pull, to give you just a simple capacity to corrupt, to allow you to create a wider criminal enterprise and activity.
So let me just ask about this. I mean, so the KGB is engaging in informal, semi-legal activities in order to do its job. To what extent were they also enriching themselves and getting away with this? I mean, where do they draw the line, or could they draw the line? And once you go over into this shady business, as President Trump might call it, how do they defend themselves to their higher ups, or
until things really began to fall apart in the 1980s? On the whole, I don't think they were enriching themselves directly. Now, I mean, obviously, there is also an indirect way in which if you've actually got a whole collection of stool pigeons who can give you information, that's great for your career. You're more likely to get bonuses. You're more likely to get sent to a sanatorium. You're more likely to get promoted. So there is an indirect way. But in terms of actual straightforward cash and goodies in hand, Not really. It's really in the 1980s, I think, that we begin to see the spread of corruption within. And I mean, and I hate to say this, but actually, I mean, the KGB was a deeply unpleasant institution, but actually KGB officers were amongst the less corrupted state officials, which, considering the amount of power they had, the amount of impunity, it is an interesting statement, I think, about the way in which, well, A, they were kept privileged, but also that indoctrination still gave them that sense of, we have a mission.
Yeah, I remember the early results of the Soviet interview project. Before everything fell apart, the only way you could get information was by interviewing emigres. And one of the surprising first results was in terms of prestige occupations. And these are people who voluntarily left the country, Jewish refugees mostly. The KGB ranked among the most prestigious and respected occupations for these ex-Soviet citizens who left in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, so in that respect, they did kind of remain pure, even while actively using this. And again, I think this for me is why it's this sort of fascinating prism through which to observe the whole the relationships. And of course, you know, tourism leads to retail, which I know we'll talk about in a moment. But I mean, I was thinking particularly just this morning, I was remembering an experience again. My gap year, I went interrailing through Europe, the classic thing to do. And while I was there, I went to East Germany, which of course you couldn't actually use your Interrail card through the little bit of East Germany. But I went to Berlin, and then when I was sort of taking the train back, I was seeing on the railway station on another platform, which was the train that went into the Soviet Union, huge numbers of young African guys, all of them carrying great big boxes. And the answer is these are all students at the Patrice Lumumba Friendship University. You know, it was part of the Soviet Union's sort of post-colonial Africa soft power campaign, bringing all these students from various African countries that have freed themselves from the imperialist yoke. We'll bring them here, we'll train them up, and above all, we'll indoctrinate them, we'll get to know them. They'll get to know us, and they will be our ambassadors, in effect, all across Africa. It didn't really work that well. And one of the problems was that these people usually had minimalist stipends from their home countries. But as part of the perks of not being a Soviet citizen, they were able to travel more easily. And therefore, one of the recognized gambits, certainly in the early 80s and late 70s, was you would travel to East Berlin for a holiday. So everyone knows that the bright lights of East Berlin are always a draw. But the point is, when you were there was a lot more access to Western electronics and such like, particularly sort of, you know, stereos and so forth. So what you do, you will have saved up your money, you will buy something there. You will then take it back to the Soviet Union, where you will sell on the black market, where actually it will earn you a lot more because it's a lot harder to get a Grundig or whatever in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad rather, or Moscow than it is in East Berlin. And so tourism was also a way, you know, or the excuse of tourism was also a way in which you actually engaged in the underground retail economy. So as Lenin said, everything connects to everything else. Tell us about your research on retail.
Sure. Let me just add one bit to that. I didn't talk about Soviet tourists going out of the country, but when they did, they were very tightly restricted and vetted, but they all took Soviet cameras and used them to trade in Czechoslovakia or Hungary for goods they could get there. That was frowned upon, but again, that's another way that tourism connected with the informal economy. Moving to retail trade, I think turns out to be the real nexus of criminality, informality, and these kinds of behaviors. And I wanted to raise a couple of points, I think. I mean, throughout the early years of Soviet history, there was a real prejudice against people who worked in trade. There was an anti-bourgeoisie prejudice, an anti-middleman prejudice that comes up not just from Bolshevism, Marxism, but from the ordinary people writ large. There was a slogan about trade: if you don't cheat, you won't sell. So there's a connection from the very beginning that trade is something unlawful, dishonorable. So by the period I'm studying, the 1960s, where I'm trying to see where things change, shop assistants enjoyed very little respect. They tended to be poorly educated young women. They were paid very little. They had little commitment to their jobs. The prestige was so low that I've seen a number of accounts in which women who are shop assistants try to hide that fact from their fiancés, for example, because they fear that they won't marry them if they realize where they're working. But those things began to change in the course of the 60s and 70s as shopping became more valued, as a consumer culture began to develop. These shop assistants had, first access to the goods that people wanted. And so now a job in retail trade, while still kind of looked down upon by the intellectuals, gave somebody access to these things that people wanted. And so the salaries went up and more people wanted to enter the trade. In the study that I've done, it's not clear how widespread was real criminality. And here's a good example of kind of the borderline between corruption and everyday informality. I've read anecdotal accounts of people who have amassed huge fortunes through cheating by short waiting in food stores, for example. They're able to buy enough, accumulate enough to buy apartments, dachas, automobiles. But I think more common was the informal practice of holding goods back for friends and family, to be part of this network. You had some prestige in your community. You weren't trying to live opulently well, but people were engaged in this kind of mutual trade of favors. At least that's what comes out in the archival material, and that's what makes me suspicious of the archival material, because the exceptional bad apples are portrayed. I did know someone in Leningrad who worked in wholesale food trade in Soviet period, who went to jail for several years for criminal activities of this group in this trade. So as with everything, there's a continuum from formal to informal to illegal. And I want to give one more example of what I find interesting about this, which are the values that underlie some of these behaviors. So in 1969, in the pages of the Soviet press, there was a huge debate about whether good service in restaurants could be improved by encouraging people to tip their waiters. Now, tipping was something that had been outlawed after the 1917 revolution, as creating two classes of people. People who tipped did so not to reward the workers, but to show off their wealth. But by the 1960s, many waiters in Soviet restaurants felt that they were underpaid, and that taking a tip was an appropriate, if informal, way for customers to show their appreciation. But in this debate, there was a huge outcry against the practice of tipping. And those that opposed it said there's really no difference between paying a tip and paying a bribe. And everybody acknowledged that bribes were illegal and corrupt. And if you engaged in this practice of tipping, you were pushing all these waiters and all these patrons of restaurants into this illegal territory as well. So what I conclude from this debate is that there is this informal economy that people rejected. So in public, they're saying, I can't stand tipping. The waiter said, I'm ashamed to receive a tip. I'm ashamed to give a tip. But they're all taking tips and they're all giving tips. On one corner of their mouth, they're saying this is wrong. On the other corner, they're saying it's okay. And so if everybody engages in this kind of everyday bribery, everyday tipping blot, which it's been called, this seems part of the system. But perhaps, and I want to get your sense of this, Mark, whether criminality begins when a class of these people start to use the informality to live better than others. I think people used informality in a way to raise everybody up, to make things a little easier. But when inequality begins to build, again, based on these decades-old values of collectivism and communism, people didn't like others living better than they were. So I wondered how your work addresses these kinds of issues of values as well as the experiences.
Yes, interesting. Just before going on, just a point about archives you mentioned again, and this is always the problem about, particularly when you're no longer in a position where you can actually talk to people and ask them about their own experiences. Once you start moving back into the historical, and this is one of the problems, because archives, and particularly the archives, mean court reports and newspaper accounts and sort of official records. Almost by definition, they are chronicles of failures. They're the people who get caught. And again, they can convey, particularly in a sort of a system which frankly prized orthodoxy and saying the right thing necessarily, or rather than what actually is true. The risk is obviously that therefore that kind of skews your assessment. And this is something that I found, particularly looking at crime statements in Soviet times. When you suddenly, under Yuri Andropov, the crime figures spike. And there's no actual suggestion that crime increased in his very brief period. Actually, quite the opposite. What it was that Andropov was notoriously intolerant of being told comforting lies. And this was actually bringing the crime figures closer in line with reality, whereas up to that point, they'd always been kept artificially low just because no one wanted to admit there was crime in the socialist paradise. So that was just a little sort of sideline. But yeah, I mean, I think this point about values is crucial. I mean, the problem with informality is we think of it as something exactly that helps smooth out the bumps in the system, humanize it, allows people to decide what is important to them rather than the state get to decide what they get. But of course, inevitably, all of these practices ultimately favor the powerful, the wealthy in whatever form. If you are a doctor, such that people need to come to you to get the sanatorium voucher, or just to get the medicines for their kids, or to get a voucher, a certificate saying that you can take a week off work or whatever. You have that much more capacity to deploy informal blatt favoritism and so forth, and therefore you'll expect to get more goodies coming your way. So there is a sense actually that it always sort of perpetuates power structures.
It's interesting in this debate, this public debate about tipping. A lot of the writers would say, would you expect a doctor to accept a tip for healing you? And then, oh, no, we wouldn't. But in fact, as you say, this was widespread that doctors are being rewarded in this way.
Obviously, we really ought to think seriously about whether or not academics ought to get tipped after a particularly good lecture. But that's a whole other matter. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the issue of values, and obviously sort of values and criminality do connect. The interesting thing was obviously, particularly as you've said, in the 60s and the early 70s, we begin to see more and more consumerism come to the Soviet Union. And in part, that was Brezhnev's little deal. You basically keep quiet, stay out of politics, but your quality of life will improve. And that put often insurmountable pressures on a system that didn't work very well. And therefore, you began to get the black economy, the informal economy emerging as an industrial scale venture. It wasn't just the individual, someone working in a shop who can hold a pair of shoes behind for their friend. It was actually when you have whole sort of underground workshops that are created inside factories, often using state resources, state property, state workers, but to produce goods for the informal sector. And that's when you have the Tsekoviki, this new breed of underground entrepreneur who, if they were successful, could be very, very rich. But this was the point. They had wealth, they had no security. How could you spend, if you do have cases of people who've got, 500,000 rubles in cash, literally sort of stacked under their bed, because they didn't know how they could safely spend this money. And so what happens is you have this interesting triangle that emerges between the magnates of the informal economy, corrupt party bosses, and organized crime. Corrupt party bosses can provide access to materials. They can provide a krisha, a roof, protection, turn a blind eye. But on the other hand, they were not going to go out on a street corner and sell individual goods. Their challenge was always how you convert that power into goodies. Not so much cash, but often exactly sort of goods and services that you can't easily find. The underground entrepreneurs often had cash and goods, but they had no security. Organized crime really emerged as the third and the weakest element of this unholy trinity, as the kind of the tissue between these that made the connection. Gangsters could talk to anyone. They could interact with anyone. And at first they started being very predatory towards the underground entrepreneurs. You have cases of, there was one particular gangster known as the Great Mongol, who was powerful in Moscow, who absolutely, his career was initially based on predating on these underground entrepreneurs because they could not go to the police. They could not even admit what had been stolen from them. So they would typically kidnap someone, take them out into the woods. In one case, literally put someone in a coffin and start sawing the coffin in half until the person decided to admit where his ill-gotten stash was. And then just simply steal it. But after a certain point, you actually had the emergence of what we almost would think of as taxation. A deal is struck whereby the main Sokoviki actually would say, well, we'll pay you this proportion of our proceeds in return for which you will leave us be. And that's a sort of essentially a negative process. It's basically, you know, I mean, yes, that's how states work, but nonetheless, in this case, it is purely sort of plunder. But once you start in the 1980s, you start getting the rise of the cooperative movement. I think this is when this interesting social duality comes in. So on the one hand, you have Gorbachev liberalizing small-scale economic activity, restaurants, again, you know, small service industry, cobbler, car mechanic, whatever, who generally these places will provide better services or services that you couldn't access easily elsewhere, but for a higher price. And on the one hand, people availed themselves of it, but on the other hand, they resented it. They regarded these people as profiteers. And so what you actually now had was a whole segment of the economy which was castigated by the masses, looked on very suspiciously by the party elite, who regarded it as an encroachment upon their privilege as well as their ideological purity, and therefore could not access the proper protections which should be available to them. The police, on the whole, didn't want to know if they were burgled. Courts would very, very rarely uphold their position in contract disputes. And so this is actually when you start getting a much more business-minded organized crime stepping in. And instead of just simply saying, lovely shop you got here, it'd be a shame if it burnt down, but was instead saying, well, what do you need? Can we help you out? Because the cooperative movement was a great way to launder cash. You know, you made your money, you know, selling moonshine, alcohol or whatever. Well, now you can justify it by saying, oh, no, we have this little barber shop that does great business. It's a way in which you can actually sort of turn your ill-gotten gains into actual property. You can buy things up. But also, exactly, what happened is you emerge as a protector, as an enforcer of contracts, really as a pseudo-state apparatus. I mean, this is something that Diego Gambetta has looked at the Sicilian mafia, and basically said that, you know, a mafia is a provider of non-state protection. And Federico Varese at Oxford has then very effectively put this model onto Russia. And I think it's very much, it's in the retail sector that we actually see this transformation of organized crime. Firstly, when they ended up filling the gap left when Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign created a distinct market for them. Secondly, sort of moving into the cooperative sector, and in the process, exactly beginning to assume the attributes of statehood informally. Because anyway, this is the whole thing. Informality is ways in which societies try to close the gap between what they want from the state, the laws, the kind of the way things are, and what is actually provided. And, you know, one would hope that in liberal democracies, that gap's pretty small. In authoritarian, clumsy, bureaucratic regimes, that gap will often be very big. But the point is, it's not actually that they're usually people are not using informality because they want to, I don't know, buy cocaine and watch snuff movies. It's actually because they need medicine for their kids, or they need a new pair of shoes, or it's the only way they can go on holiday. You know, things that they feel are rightfully theirs. It's actually, again, it's all about the moral economy of society. Yeah. And criminals and others could just simply feel that.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we make mistakes thinking that the regime tried to deprive the people of all of this, and hence the criminality and the informal moved in. You know, my research, again, from the official records, shows they really understood the problems. They're really trying to fix them. They recognized that people wanted to buy stuff. It wasn't just, I don't think it was just the little deal. That was what the promise of socialism was, that people could actually enjoy a decent life. The puzzle for me is still, why couldn't they deliver this? You know, why was it necessary for the informal economy to seep in? Was it that informality became so much of a way, a comfortable way of operating, that became a self-perpetuating practice. Was it crime and in alliance with the police that, you know, moved the needle to that side of the stage? This is what's so fascinating about this period, and what is so great about having the resources at CEIS, people like you and Ileana, to talk about these things and try to figure these things out.
But I mean, it is, you know, what comes first. And I think the trouble is, it is, let's face it, something of a chicken and egg thing, is exactly what comes first. I mean, it is clear that state priorities were not, on the whole, towards what the masses wanted. You know, they were printing Karl Marx, not Agatha Christie. I remember seeing this extraordinary statistic that in the late Soviet times, that the largest source of household fires was exploding television sets. And the reason for that is the cathode ray tubes were also the ones used in military radar sets. And the military industrial complex had the priority. So basically, they got to pick the ones that had been well made, and all the shoddily made ones ended up in TV sets instead. I mean, this is it. Unfortunately,
I wondered why I was told to unplug my television set every night before going to bed.
Absolutely right. It's common sense. But the point is, yes, but in some ways, for me, that whole question of carryover, I mean, again, it's crucial for understanding post-1991, and why Russia emerged as Russia has. And in part, it is because, you know, there are certain expectations and certain assumptions that are carried forth. You know, I remember talking to police officers in the 1990s who, you know, regarded it as a no-brainer that, you know, you have a badge and a gun. Well, of course, you're going to enrich yourselves as a perk of the job. But on the other hand, they were also paid, I mean, you know, a beat cop in what was a very dangerous time was paid as much as a municipal bus driver. So in some ways, there's another level, what do you expect? And in some ways, this is going back to the old pre-revolutionary practice of kormlenie, feeding, whereby you didn't pay your officials that much because you assumed that they'd had their side deals. And again, that means that it's almost actually, you're actually pricing people out of honesty. You know, if someone really wants to be honest, not only are they going to have the problem of all their colleagues looking at them askance, saying basically, you know, why are you not playing the game the same way as us? But at the same time, you are condemning yourself and quite possibly your family to penury because you're not earning how you're meant to earn. Now, I mean, that is slowly changing, certainly when it comes to the police. But that's the whole point. It's a really difficult generational thing. And I mean, it wanders into sort of politically fraught territory, but certainly talking to, for example, FBI people in the States when I was there, you know, they said that Russian organized crime in the United States was really good at fraud, still is, particularly Medicare and Medicaid fraud, huge amounts stolen. And it's in part, they say, well, because these people are used to operating with clunky, clumsy bureaucracies and knowing their ways round them and finding the loopholes. And there are a few clunkier and clumsier bureaucracies than American Medicare and Medicaid. And they almost regard that as, well, that's the norm. Now, again, it changes over time, and it certainly doesn't apply to every Russian emigre or expat or anything like that. But the point is, these attitudes, they are both a product of the society in which they operate, but they also shape it as well, because, you know, you have understandings and expectations, and we all think, well, if I expect this and I'm not getting this, am I wrong or is the state wrong? Well, we'll usually think the state is wrong. So where are you thinking of taking your research next?
Well, I'm still working on further aspects of the problem of consumer culture in the 1960s. One of the important parts of the 60s is this attempt to enact economic reforms in the mid-1960s to try to make the economy look more like a market economy, to make it more efficient, to provide the right incentives. And so again, I'm using the retail sector primarily, department stores, restaurants, food stores, to try to see how this worked in practice and why it was that they really fizzled out by the mid-1970s. Was it because people didn't understand how they worked? Were they not lucrative enough for this prior system of informality? So I'm still playing around with these kinds of questions.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I have a variety of projects, but one in particular, actually it's a massive project and a total act of hubris, but it's a global history of organized crime, sort of everywhere. So it's from Aztec cocoa bean counterfeiters and Imperial Roman smugglers, all the way through to the present day. And again, one of the underlying premises is essentially that as societies get organized, so too do their underworlds, that one is a dark shadow of the other. Because if you think about organized crime, we see it in Imperial Rome. We don't really see it through the Middle Ages, because you can't really have crime when you don't really have much laws and so forth. And where does organized crime, as we understand it, really re-emerge? It's in Renaissance Italy and Renaissance Netherlands. Again, the cradles of a growing mercantile banking sort of economy. But part of that is exactly this whole issue of informality and crime. Because in a way, what is crime? Crime is whatever the state or society says is crime. We would regard slavery as crime today. In Imperial Rome, it was actually a very serious crime to free a slave. And therefore, it's these issues of what happens when the values and the moral economy of the state diverges from that of society. Whichever one has actually done the changing, it doesn't really matter. It creates this gap, and usually that's precisely the vacuum that criminality fills. So I think, again, this is the way that sort of studying informality in Russia and the Soviet Union, and Russia again, actually also sort of illuminates processes which, frankly, we've seen so long as humanity has been organizing itself.
Well, I'm very much in favor of an approach to the study of our region that makes it not unique and standing somehow completely different, but is really part of world historical challenges and processes. So I wish you great luck on this massive project, and I look forward to reading it.
Someday. Don't expect it soon.
Okay. Great.
Thank you both very much. That was absolutely fascinating. So yeah, thank you very much, Diane and Mark, and thank you to everyone that watched, and watch out for the next edition coming soon.